Thank you for the introduction, and thank you everyone for being with me here today. I am so excited to talk to you about a paper that I wrote on the financialization of housing in Ontario and policy options for addressing housing affordability. So to give a bit of my name is Tsahai Carter, and I live in the city of Toronto, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Wendat peoples. I recently graduated from the University of Ottawa, and as a young person, as a recent graduate, housing affordability is a major concern for me, and I think it is for many of us in the room. We know that it's an issue, and thankfully, we have a lot of great people who are doing a lot of work to solve this issue. But as I looked into housing affordability, one thing that I noticed is that the conversation was very focused on increasing supply. We need to build more. I agree with that. I think it's very important. But I wonder if there's some other considerations that might be missing from the discussion. Housing affordability is a complex issue. It involves a lot of actors, from builders to everyday people, many different levels of government, and there's many different policies that need to be done to address it, including zoning and interest rates. But my paper has a bit more of a narrow focus. It focuses on the province of Ontario, but I do think that there's things that apply to across Canada and maybe even across the globe. It focuses on the provincial government and local governments, but most importantly, it focuses on residential real estate investment. As I looked at the state of housing, I had to wonder who is making bids on houses that are $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 above asking price. Who is setting rents at such astronomical rates? And how do they have the ability to do this? And thankfully, there's been research that's come out from Statistics Canada and from the CMHC that shows that real estate investment has rapidly increased in the past few years, and at the same time as the increase in housing and affordability. To the point where almost 40% of new condominium units in Ontario are owned by real estate investors. That's, an insane amount of the stock, and it's a lot of new condos, things that would normally be going to recent graduates, to seniors who are looking to downsize, and to generally lower income people, that's being instead taken up by wealthier investors. But before I go any further, I'd like to talk about who is an investor. So Statistics Canada kind of defines three categories. There are non-investors, people who just own and live in their home. There are investor occupants, which is someone who owns one property with multiple units. So this could be someone who owns a triplex and rents out two of the units, or even just someone who rents out a basement apartment. And lastly, there are investors. This is someone who owns more than one property that is not their primary residence. And this paper and this discussion is focused on that last category. I make this distinction because it's important to consider the role of housing in Ontario. Housing is a place to live, but it's also, a symbolic symbol, and it's also just really important for financial stability, for generating wealth, and for passing down wealth. So keeping that in mind and keeping in mind the importance of home ownership and, the different types of housing that's available to people is always important as I go through this discussion. But coming back to solutions, as we began to look at housing and affordability, and as we begin to tackle this issue and consider building more housing, I think it's really important to consider access to housing and the function of housing. I think we can all agree that housing is a human right, but I don't think it's always treated as such. And if we want to build more housing and make sure that we actually address unaffordability, there needs to be more additional policy changes in order to ensure that housing goes to the people who really need it the most. One great thing is that there's a lot of jurisdictions in Canada and across the globe that are doing really amazing work to address real estate investment and housing and affordability issues. And I've looked towards some of these jurisdictions to see what's being done, what's working and what isn't, and what Ontario can learn from these many places. When it comes to addressing real estate investment, the paper's kind of split into two tracks, and this first one is about three main policy areas where changes can be made immediately in order to reduce the negative impacts of real estate investment and reduce the number of real estate investors in the market. The first area concerns tax policies, and a number of different policies in order to decrease the incentives to buy additional properties just for investment purposes, and also generate some revenue that can be put back towards the community. One main one in this area is expanding speculation taxes. Right now in Ontario, foreign buyers have an additional tax rate if they're trying to purchase, and there's some ban on foreign buyers nationally. But to be honest, most real estate investors are not foreign. They are local people, they are Canadians, and if we want to tackle issues of real estate investment, it has to address Canadian investors as well. Second area considers vacant homes taxes. This has already been implemented in the City of Toronto and has seen some success in Vancouver and in BC. And this is a great way to open up more units available for rentals. And the last one is expanding rent control. We in Ontario are fortunate to already have a decent rent control system that really does protect a lot of tenants, but it can be expanded. It can be expanded to newer units that have been excluded, and it can be expanded to be more so tied to units rather than tenants, because right now, as soon as a tenant vacates a unit, there's no limits on how much a rent can be increased, and that does really drive up prices quickly. I think that all of these solutions here are really important, and they can drive, kind of rapid and immediate change that's needed in order to reduce the current pressure and give people access to housing right now. But I don't think that it's going to create the long-term change that we need for a financially sustainable housing market. And that's why the second part of the paper addresses social housing. Social housing in Ontario and in North America more generally, or public housing, has a very negative connotation. It's considered to be unsafe, unsanitary. I think there's a lot of racial bias and xenophobia associated with public housing, but public housing doesn't have to be a bad thing. At its most basic definition, public housing is housing that is owned, cooperatively or publicly, and that is not designed to turn a profit. So with a robust system of public housing, it's possible to provide housing as a right without people who are looking to make a profit from it, and that can be really, really important. But in order for large-scale public housing to work, there's a couple of things that need to be kept in mind to counter negative perceptions and also design and provide high-quality public housing. It should be, aesthetically pleasing. It should be comfortable and safe, and it should be built in accessible and walkable neighborhoods. And public housing can really give people a chance to have a stake in their housing. For those who can't afford to buy, or for those who just don't want to buy, because not everyone wants to own and manage their own home, public housing gives people a chance to have a say in where they live, how it's run, and how it's built. Looking across the globe, we know that public housing can work. Vienna, Austria is kind of the model for public housing, where more than 60% of residents live in public housing, and they have many different models for this. There are cooperative options. There's also public housing that's built and managed by non-for-profit companies, and those that are actually directly owned and managed by the government. And these different models work together to provide a lot of access to affordable and high-quality housing for Viennans. As I mentioned before, this is a really complex issue. There's no single solution towards creating housing affordability. And these policies need to work together. We can implement taxes and use that revenue to start building public housing. These things happen at the same time, and they should happen at the same time as we consider zoning policies and how we're going to build more and how we're going to work on construction practices and approvals. These things all go together, and I believe that combating the financialization of housing in Ontario is a really important step towards creating a sustainable, accessible, and affording housing system for everyone. So thank you so much for having me here today, and I'm looking forward to our panel to continue hearing about solutions towards addressing this housing affordability issue that's affecting all of us.